I'm Dr. Alvin Thomas. My work and this show is dedicated to educating, validating, elevating, and celebrating the importance of Black fatherhood. This is the Black Fatherhood Podcast. You have probably by now heard the social indictment of driving while black, or riding while black, or even shopping while black. And while it sometimes sounds comical, safe spaces for black men and black people in America has been a point of concern. Several years ago, our next guest set out to better understand why so few people who look like him seek out adventure in the natural world, whether by striding along a forest trail or tramping up an icy glacier. Why don't we think of black people going swimming, surfing, fishing, birding, or camping? Why are there still spaces we assume black people shouldn't be in? Today, we're talking about how Black Americans, in both perception and practice, fall into what our guest calls the adventure gap. James Mills is a freelance journalist and National Geographic Explorer who specializes in telling stories about outdoor recreation, environmental conservation, acts of charitable giving, and practices of sustainable living. He has worked in the outdoor industry since 1989 as a guide, outfitter, independent sales representative, writer, and photographer. He is the author of the book The Adventure Gap: Changing the Face of the Outdoors, and co writer or co producer of the documentary film An American Ascent. James has written for the Wisconsin State Journal, Madison Magazine, and Wisconsin Trails. He is currently a contributor to several outdoor focused print and online publications, such as National Geographic, Rock and Ice, Alpinist, Elevation Outdoors, Park Advocate, High Country News, Land and the People, Sierra, Backpacker, Outside Magazine, The New York Times, and The Guardian. Welcome to the show,
It
James.
is an absolute pleasure to be here. Thank you so much for having me.
There's so much that we can talk about, but I'm hoping to try to direct the conversation a little bit just because I know we have limited time and there's just, like I said, this is a very interesting space. So you've written quite extensively and across so many platforms, but specifically written about your own trajectory into nature as a young Boy Scout and kid going on adventure weekend trips with your dad and brother. Tell us a little bit more about that.
Well, I, first of all, was fortunate to have grown up in, oddly enough, Los Angeles, California, which is not the most outdoorsy place that you might imagine. But, being in a major metropolitan area, it's actually right on the beach and it's very close to the San Bernardino Mountains, the San Gabriel Mountains. And then from there, you have the entire Sierra Nevada mountain range. And from the age of 9 until I was 18, I was part of the oldest Boy Scout troop west of the Mississippi. It was troop number 10. And literally from a very early age until I graduated from high school, many of my weekends were spent camping or rock climbing or backcountry skiing or snowshoeing. And there's so many different activities that were part of my growing up. And I think part of it too was my parents were civil rights activists, but also they were technically civil servants, but my mother was a administrator for Los Angeles School District, and my father was a Superior Court judge. And they were both very socially and politically active. And I think that one of the things that was very important to them was that they afforded their children the same opportunities that many of their friends and colleagues who were white were affording to their children. And that included spending time in the outdoors. And that meant having weekend camping trips. That meant weekends at a summer cabin. That meant being able to go skiing and a wide variety of other things. And so much of my growing up was centered around my interest and passion for being able to spend time in the outdoors. And that ultimately led to a career that I've enjoyed now for over 30 years.
So it's amazing that and I think some people might think, oh, well, he grew up with parents who had a certain amount of access. And so maybe that's why he's involved. I remember my own life as a Boy Scout in the Caribbean. Very different, of course, from growing up in California, a very, very tiny island. But I and shout out to Troop Number 10, James's old stomping grounds. But I remember being a Boy Scout myself, and my parents were not involved in scouting, and they definitely didn't have the access to be able to give me some of those other things. But they would say, if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it. We'll pay for you to do this camp, or we'll pay for you to do this hike. And I went out and just figured out how to enjoy some of those spaces, and that kind of helped chart the kind of person that I am today. So, regardless of access, I think there are other ways that people can also find themselves in some of these spaces. So, there's this misconception that Black Americans did not have a role in exploration and discovery of the natural world that is North America. And but you write about the history of Black explorers in your book. Can you tell us a little bit about some of the main figures? I know you've, for example, spoken about Pedro Alonso Nino, also known as El Negro, who kind of helped piloted the Santa Maria, and you talked about enslaved persons from New York who were part of the Lewis and Clark expedition, and a number of other individuals who you mentioned in that collection of history of Black Americans who were part of the exploration of the original continent.
Well, and that's one of the things that we don't often learn about in history. In fact, if you leave it exclusively up to the history that you learn in school, you would think that there aren't any people of color engaged or involved in exploration. You mentioned Pedro Alonso Nino. The Lewis and Clark expedition had a Black American play a vital role in the exploration of North America in 1803. An enslaved man by the name of York. But there's also Sacagawea and her husband, who were part of that
Mm,
expedition too, that are included but aren't really elevated to the point where you start to think, wow, they really had a vital role here. But then when you go on to take a look at other historic characters like the members of the 25th Infantry that were formerly enslaved people who were in the American U.S. Army, who were part of the protection and exploration of areas like Yellowstone and Yosemite. These same men ultimately were part of the very first major bicycle tour of the Western United States, starting from Missoula, Montana, riding bicycles 1,900 miles to St. Louis, Missouri in the year 1897. And then you go on to the Buffalo Soldiers and the roles that they played in the protection and development of Yosemite as a national park in 1903. You mean the stories that are available to look at are pretty remarkable. I mean, you take a look at a character like Matthew Henson, who in 1909 became the very first person, black or white, to make it to the North Pole. We talk about Robert Peary as the leader of the expedition, but history doesn't tell us that Henson was in the lead sled. He was the person who
mhm.
actually impressed his footprints first on the North Pole. So these are the stories that we ultimately don't know about. And when we take the time to learn about them, we realize that people of color have had a vested, informed interest in outdoor recreation since the very beginning.
So a lot of these names, I mean, had it not been for maybe, I think maybe my first introduction to the idea of Buffalo Soldiers would have probably been through Bob Marley's song, and figured out who are is this like some fictional thing that he's talking about, and then to find out, no, these were actually men who looked like me and who looked like my father and who looked like my brother and my nephew. These were men who looked like us and were instrumental in developing the country that we know today that we're so proud of. And just recognizing that if they look like me and were part of this instrumental development of America, then why should I not also be in some of those spaces? I have the right to be in some of those spaces. You talk about this adventure gap, and you say the adventure gap is real. In 2010, of the nearly 40 million people who participated in outdoor activities in the US, nearly 80% were white. That is amazing. And although that has improved with regard to Black and Hispanic peoples since 2010, I can't believe that it's improved so much that it's almost 50-50, or even 60-40, or anything close to that over the last 12 years. Tell us a little bit about this adventure gap and why it is that there's such a huge disparity in white versus non-white people in these spaces.
I think that one of the things that people automatically assume is that, well, black people just don't like to go camping. Black
Mm,
people just don't like to go skiing. And I really wish that it was just that simple. And we take a look culturally and historically, and that definitely plays itself out if you look back just a decade or two. But if we go back to the beginning, now I just outlined several historic figures that ground the Black experience in outdoor recreation, going back to the earliest explorers of North America. But when you take a look at the development of the modern outdoor recreation slash conservation movement, we run into a major cultural social obstacle, and that's the Jim Crow era. So directly after the Civil War, immediately following Reconstruction, we have a period of racial segregation under the Plessy versus Ferguson decision that basically entitles us to have an environment that is separate but equal. But separate is never equal, especially when you have legal segregation in all forms of American life. And one of those forms took place in the creation of our national parks. So the National Park Service was created in 1916 under legislation put forth by the U.S. Congress, but signed into law by Woodrow Wilson. Now, it's important that we take a look at who Woodrow Wilson was. Woodrow Wilson was the first Southern Democrat voted to the presidency since Lincoln. Okay, so for the very
mm,
first time, we have a white Southerner in the White House. And
mhm.
that creates a huge problem because he's basically an unapologetic white supremacist. In
Right.
fact, with that, the very first film ever to be shown in the White House is Birth of a Nation in 1914.
Hmm.
And he was quoted as saying that it was history written in lightning. And the only thing more profound about it is that this story is absolutely true. And so he comes into the White House, with this spirit of racial superiority that he immediately brings into the federal government. And so in 1914 through 1916, as the National Park Service is being created, one of the very first things that he does is that he segregates the national park system so that if you are a black person, specifically a black man, you cannot become a national park ranger. Okay,
Hmm.
and that also in terms of who can visit and go to national parks is racially segregated as well. So we have the Buffalo Soldiers in 1903 protecting and patrolling Yosemite and Sequoia national parks. They go on to serve in the First World War, and they come back as civilians, and they can't become national park rangers in the very parks that they protected a decade earlier. Okay, and so that's the beginning of our national park system, and that would ultimately be true in this country until 1945. Okay, so you have racial
Wow.
segregation of our national park system all the way through the end of the Second World War. And so now we're getting, into my parents' generation where we have this very profound racial segregation that is emblematic in the creation of our recreation culture. And with that, we also have a entire generation of people who basically say, you can't go there, you can't do this. These are things that are not for you. So it's not a matter of us deciding that this wasn't something that we're interested in. This was something that we told very explicitly that we couldn't do. And it really wasn't until we have Mary McLeod Bethune and the Black Congress under the aegis of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and specifically Eleanor Roosevelt, that we have the desegregation of the national park system. And the national parks aren't fully desegregated until 1952. And as it happens, my
Hmm.
parents were married in 1953, and they honeymooned in Yosemite. So they were among the very first Black Americans to actually be able to take advantage of the new freedoms. But again, this is my mom and dad. We're not talking about people 100 years ago. This is only just within my lived experience, my
Right.
generation is for the very first time we have outdoor recreation being part of familial culture. And we don't get formal recruitment of national park rangers who are people of color until 1963. Okay, so this is 3 years before I'm born. And we have the introduction of Black park rangers. For example, my good friend Robert Stanton became the first park ranger to be recruited to Grand Teton National Park. And then he goes on to become the first superintendent of the Frederick Douglass National Historic Site. And he's the very first superintendent of a national park site since Charles Young, the leader of the Buffalo Soldiers, was the superintendent of Sequoia National Park 60 years
Jeez.
earlier. Okay, so you have this
Jeez.
enormous separation of time between the Buffalo Soldiers of the early 20th century to the introduction of Black folks as park rangers, as park visitors, until 1963. And so then I'm born in 1966. And so literally mine is one of the very first generations that actually has free, unadulterated access to the outdoors. And this is the generation that we are now trying to become engaged and educated in, hopefully very explicitly and deliberately making the outdoors more accessible to everyone. And we do that by getting out there, by doing the things that we enjoy, by having positive experiences, and hopefully encouraging other people to follow in our example.
It's amazing how policy, when laid out in very systematic and very agenda set ways, can have long term historical implications. So, a policy that was set in place all the way back to Woodrow Wilson and before continued to have an impact all the way to your birth. You weren't even around when this man that was president, and his policies sat on the books and affected the lives of millions. And I'm sure people were looking back and saying, but look, we had the first black superintendent of parks and we had the first black whatever. And you think to yourself, for there to be a first black, how many millions were denied that access?
Right.
And so we can celebrate that first black, but it means for that at that point in time, that first black is also the only black. And there's all that space before where there is no black, and then that space during where there's only one black, and the space that comes after where there will only be a very incremental change to the number of persons who are included in those spaces. And so I try I'm deliberately pulling this into context because that's what we're seeing in fatherhood as well. It's not just in the space of black people in different spaces, but also thinking about black fathers and fathers in general in different spaces. What that means, how policies influence people, how people appear or don't appear in spaces. Thank you so much, James, for s- giving us this really rich historical survey of this issue. And we see that historical survey, we see that those policy effects. But talk to us a little bit about some of the barriers that exist to those spaces. So, thinking of cultural barriers, geographical barriers, financial barriers that exist with regard to access to those spaces for some families, usually marginalized families.
Sure. So, I mean, we're talking very specifically about the policies of national parks. Okay, but we can also take a look at the policies of neighborhoods,
Hmm.
namely the era of redlining through the 1930s. I mean, we have an entire economic structure built on the notion that home ownership is going to be the vehicle for social and economic success. And in the 1930s, at the height of the Depression, home ownership was one of the things that was going to correct many of the economic imbalances of the Great Depression. The problem is that those policies were restrictive of people of color. And we have these policies known as redlining. And redlining essentially designates where people can live. And you ultimately have clusters of intergenerational poverty because we have entire financial institutions from the federal level down that restrict the ability to own a home. You restrict the ability to accrue generational wealth and then pass that wealth on to other people, namely your family, your children, but also being able to distribute that wealth within your community. And so that, and then we also have the double-edged sword of the fact that our schools are funded by property values. So that if you've got poorly funded and supported homes, you have poorly funded and supported schools. So you basically have this downward spiral of poverty that is virtually impossible to get out of. But when it comes to outdoor recreation, though, that very specifically relates to two very specific things. Number one, you have a limited access to green space
Hmm.
because most of the best homes are going to be in areas with trees, with grass, with free flowing fresh water, basically the suburbs. Okay, and it's from that understanding of how we create a cultural environment that is inducive to a relationship with the natural environment that ultimately defines one's role in terms of what they do for quote unquote recreation. You also have a paradigm of de facto urbanization, so that if you are a person of color, you are required to live in a city. Okay, there was a time in this country where a black person could have $1 million in cash and not be able to purchase a home in a suburban community by law. And so essentially that creates an environment where you have a very clear distinction between where people can live, where they can go, what they can do culturally and socially. The other part of this equation, unfortunately, too, is the social stability of home ownership gives you the three things that are required for outdoor recreation: disposable income, leisure time, and desire. Okay, so if you don't have intergenerational wealth, if you don't have the ability to have job security, you're not going to have the disposable income that it'll take to have a vacation. You also won't have the leisure time to be able to enjoy those outdoor experiences. You also, and this is I think critical because we add to the notion that outdoor recreation is a cultural paradigm defined by cultural social
Hmm.
identity. And you have people in wooded areas who firmly believe that people of color don't belong there. And so you have the added disadvantage of the very real possibility of racially motivated violence perpetrated by complete strangers because they believe that you're in a place that you don't belong.
Right.
Okay, so that when we put all of these things together, that is essentially the formation of what I describe in my book as the adventure gap. Because you have these
Hmm.
very clear cultural social barriers that prevent people of color from accessing all of the things that makes it possible to enjoy a relationship with the outdoors. Because all of these things ultimately add up to an intergenerational aversion to having these kinds of experiences. And that makes it difficult for each subsequent generation to decide that, yes, this is something that I want to do. I don't have any role models. I don't have any easy access to get over these barriers. And that ultimately creates a situation where you lose the desire and that idea that you had to go outside to do something interesting or exciting just isn't there. And so you wind up doing something else that's culturally, socially acceptable. And in our society, that means doing the sports that we see people of color engaged in: football, baseball, basketball.
Hmm.
Why? Those are all urban activities. Okay,
Right.
and then you add to that things like skiing. Okay, you
Hmm.
add to that even equestrian sports. I mean, like there are like so many different activities that are determined by the places that we live, the things that we are allowed to do culturally and socially, and that's going to have very clear distinctions between who does what, how they do it, where, and with whom.
Thank you so much. That is such a very deep and nuanced explanation of some of these barriers, and by no means an exhaustive explanation, but definitely deep and nuanced. So essentially, these barriers also have the possibility of creating actual life and death situations. You talk about people being perceived as not belonging in some of the spaces that they might find themselves wandering into or deliberately going into. So, going out for a hike and coming across an individual who thinks that you don't need to be on this trail, you don't need to be out in the forest, or you don't need to be on this beach. And we saw some cases of this, for example, where people thought that others didn't or shouldn't be in those spaces and were perceived as threats. So, for example, we saw the Christian Cooper example. That's the Central Park birder, or the teenager in the New York City hotel who was falsely accused of stealing a phone because he happened to be in a luxury hotel, rightfully so, with his parents, but still, suddenly there was the perception of threat just by being present. How can we normalize the idea that Black people can be in these quote unquote not normally Black spaces? How do you normalize that experience or that reality for not just Black people, but for people in general?
I think that the best way to do it is to be there, to take up space in spaces where we have every right to be, but we are culturally told that we shouldn't be there. And for some people, that's a bridge too far. Especially when they're thinking, well, I don't want to put myself at risk. I certainly don't want to put my family at risk. I don't
Right.
want to put myself in an unpleasant situation, so I'm just going to avoid it altogether. One of the things that we've done culturally, especially over the last decade, is create what are described as affinity groups, where we basically create the environment where we have shared cultural social experience, where we have shared values, but also safety in numbers, so that we can collectively have a positive experience doing these things, so that when we are out there, we are doing these things in a supportive community of people who want to see us be successful, people who want to be able to have the same shared experience that we're having, and that ultimately you'll be able to establish the skills and the resilience and the expectation that this is indeed a place where you belong. Now, the one thing that I'm always going to caution people on when doing this is the last thing I want is for people to feel that they can only go into these spaces if they're in a large group of people of color.
Right.
Okay, I think that the affinity group space is a great place to start, but it can't be the only way that you have these experiences. So that with those experiences, you say to yourself, okay, I'm going to go on a solo bike trip. I'm going to go on a solo hiking trip. I mean, all of these things that white people do without even thinking about it. Yeah,
Right.
I want to make sure that people of color feel that they too can have those positive experiences as well without having to form a club, in
Right.
order to
Right.
make it happen. So that they can go into a retail store and not be questioned as to whether or not they have the skills and expertise necessary to purchase a pair of hiking poles or a pair of boots. You know, with these cultural, social collective experiences, I'm hoping that we'll be able to create an environment where people will be able to see themselves as part of these experiences and go out and have very positive experiences of their own.
It's amazing you talk about that because I think of a couple of experiences that I've had recently, and by recently I mean in the last few days, where you go and some people might have the reaction that, well, of course you can go anywhere you want. This is America. America is free. You can go to anywhere you want, and you should feel comfortable. But I think of the last few days experiences where I walked into certain stores or into certain spaces, and while nobody told me that I didn't need to be there, the interaction was different. So you see people looking over their shoulders. Everybody in the store keeps looking over at you as if like, what? What? Nobody else in the store looks like you. And you keep getting these looks. And the looks are meant maybe part of just regular curiosity. But when I go down to the grocery store, nobody looks at me with curiosity. And I look at nobody with curiosity because I expect that anybody can be in here. But when people suddenly start looking at you with curiosity, what they're telling you is, I don't expect you to be here.
Right.
Right? And how real that is. I love the fact that you talk about the adventure gap, but you also are doing work to address that adventure gap. So, for example, I know you tell the story in the Adventure Gap, your book, The Adventure Gap. You tell the story of Expedition Denali. Tell us a little bit about that expedition.
Well, the goal was to do something that had never been done before, and that was put a team of black climbers on the summit of the highest peak in North America. And the goal also was to be able to create a cadre of role models who could go back into their community and share their experiences with people who look like them. Because we could have, found a group of mountaineers that could just climb the mountain. That was only half the goal. The goal was to make sure that we could use that experience as a storytelling vehicle to be able to share that experience. And it's been this year is the 10th anniversary of Expedition Denali, and so I'm not letting any cats out of the bag by letting people know that the team was not successful in actually reaching the summit, but they were successful in making it home safely and to share their experience. And the great thing about it is that they inspired other people to have similar experiences of their own, and so that we, after this project, started seeing a lot more black people climbing mountains, specifically
Mm-hmm.
a mountain like Denali. And it became less of a challenge and more of an opportunity for people to express themselves in ways that they'd never been given the opportunity to express themselves like that before. And everyone constantly says, well, what's the big deal? Anybody can go. Well, if anybody could go, anybody would go. So why aren't they? So there are clearly barriers here. And one of those barriers is literally as simple as not seeing anybody who looks like you. One of those barriers is not having anybody who can train you, who will give you the skills, expertise, and experience in order to make that happen. And I was very fortunate to have a lot of good partners like the National Outdoor Leadership School, affinity groups like Outdoor Afro, Girl Trek, even Latino Outdoors, which is an organization that I've worked with over the years that was incredibly supportive of this effort. These are the kinds of things that I think are critical in terms of being able to have these very positive role model, groundbreaking experiences so that, again, we normalize the behavior, so that we can have the first, but not just so that we can have the first and then walk away. We need to make sure that we have the first and the next.
Right.
Because, I'm not as interested as I used to be about who the first black person was to do anything. I'm more curious to know who the next black person is to
Yeah.
do something. I had a young man tell me something that was pretty remarkable. He said, I don't want to be the exception. I want to be the rule.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't want to be the one guy out of 10,000 to make it into Harvard. I don't want to be the one guy out of a million that makes it to the summit of Mount Everest or any one of 1,000 other things. I want to be one of the many who have these positive experiences out of just sheer recognition of my humanity, because this is what human beings do. And I think that once we normalize the behavior, this conversation, I'm looking forward to one day being quaint. you know,
Yeah.
because it's like I really look forward to you and I being in our 80s, recalling this conversation and saying, guys, remember back in the day when these things were an issue? You know, I'm really hoping that one day it won't be something that we're going to need to be talking about. But I'm pretty sure that Frederick Douglass had the same conversation with W.E.B. Du Bois, that basically says, I really wish we didn't have to have these conversations anymore. Okay, that was 100 years ago. All right, and here we are still having this conversation now. So I have every confidence that the work will continue, but we're going to need to keep working at it.
Yeah. And you're not saying that all black people should go out climbing mountains. Because if that's what you're saying, I'm telling you straight off the bat, I will not be climbing the mountains. I would not be trying to climb
Which is
Denali
totally
or
totally
anything
fine.
else.
But I don't ever want you to think that you couldn't.
Right,
Okay.
exactly,
And that's
exactly.
the critical difference. I'm not. I mean, because again, I will be the first person to admit that this type of thing is not for everybody. Okay, not
Mhm.
everybody wants to be cold. Not everybody wants to be out of breath. Not everybody wants to be tired. Not everyone wants to sleep on the ground. In fact, there are people who spend their entire lives trying to avoid those things.
Right,
Okay, but if there is an opportunity or an interest that you want to pursue that you think might be interesting, you should have that opportunity, and you shouldn't talk yourself out of that opportunity, and
right.
you shouldn't have to have someone talk you out of that opportunity. I don't ever want a kid to look at themselves and they say, well, I can't do that because that's not what my people do. Because that's the other part of the equation as well, because it's not just white people telling black people what they can't do. It's other black people telling what black people can and can't do.
Yep, yep.
Is there are young people who will basically say that that's not what my people do. And they say those things because they want to embrace their full cultural identity, and I get that. Okay, but my cultural identity personally includes going for a hike. Okay, my personal identity includes going camping and skiing and a wide variety of other things. The last thing I want is to have a black person tell me that I'm trying to act white. Okay, the reality is that these are things that my parents did. These are things that I have done my entire life, and that does not make me less of a black person for wanting to have these experiences. Just like I refuse to allow people to assume that I'm a better dancer than I am. Okay, or that I'm necessarily good at
I am not
multitasking.
going down that route with you.
These are the other cultural social stereotypes that we wind up
Right.
buying into as if we are a cultural social monolith. And the reality is that we're all different human beings that can choose to have whatever expression that we are allowed to do. And that's why, to me, something like outdoor recreation, is among the last acts of the civil rights movement, because these are things that we choose to do when there are people who are telling us that we shouldn't or we can't. And ironically, when it comes to national park preservation and the preservation of public land, that these are also rights and privileges that we could technically lose if we don't exercise them. Because that if we collectively, and this is, I think, the big takeaway, and this is why these issues are so important. Black Americans will probably and definitely, well, no, there's no probably about it. We will definitely be the majority of the population. I'm sorry, people of color will be the majority of the population by the year 2045. That means that we will have a quote unquote minority majority population, meaning that fully more than 50% of the US population will be non white. Okay, so what happens if nothing changes And we still have only 80% of national park visitors being white people when they represent less than 50% of the population. Okay, there will come a time when we will have a vote as to whether or not we're going to maintain the idea of national
National.
park
Yeah.
preservation. And if fully 50% of the population has no affinity for nature, why wouldn't we take the time to plow under every national park and pave it? Okay, why
Yeah.
wouldn't we opt for energy extraction as opposed to natural resource conservation? So for all those people out there who are wondering, oh, well, I don't care if black people go camping. Why should I worry about those things? It's not preventing me from having any positive experiences. Well, it's not having an impact yet, okay? But given enough time, okay, as the population shifts to favor the interests of an emerging population, okay, if that population is not allowed to embrace the things that we love and revere and respect, and that's not just outdoor recreation. I mean,
It's a lot of
it's
other
everything.
issues.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
it's the body politic. It's the notion of a judicial system that is free and balanced and allowing the due process of law. I mean, all of these things. If we lose faith and confidence in all of those things as a nation, okay, our entire ability to have a worthwhile and productive place to live goes away. So we can start with outdoor recreation, but it goes all the way up to, you know, cultural, social, civil rights. It goes to the labor movement. It goes to everything. To me, my ability to go camping is just the canary in the coal mine.
I love how, James, you have taken this from the point of view of outdoor recreation and talked about how essentially that a seemingly innocuous issue is connected to every other issue that we both take for granted and hold very dear to us. And so I want to pull in our final piece talking about this fly fishing. And again, it sounds like it's just about fly fishing, but it's not just about fly fishing. It's about who we are as people. Talk a little bit about this documentary that you're working on around fly fishing.
This is not unlike Expedition Denali. My a group of friends and I went back to Alaska, and instead of climbing, and frankly, part of it is because I've gotten older, and I'm not the climber that I used to be. We went fly fishing in the gates of the Arctic National Park in Alaska along the Kobuk River, and the idea basically was to take five black guys and go fishing. But this is a major expedition. I mean, it took us two planes to get to the campsite that we ultimately used. We're literally the only people there for thousands and thousands of miles, but we had clear and unfettered access to one of the most remote national parks in the country, if not the world. And the idea basically was to sit and fish and talk about what it is to be a black man in the outdoors. And for many of us, this was one of the very first experiences that we've had where this was a fully uh, organized, run, executed, operated expedition of black men. The idea ultimately was to be able to, again, tell our story and then bring it back to our respective communities. And so, our conversation essentially is on camera and we're talking to each other, but we're also talking to a broad general audience about the things that we go through, but also the joy that we get to spend time in the outdoors. Ultimately, we really, really, really hope that we'll be able to take those experiences and translate a wilderness area that is thousands and thousands of miles away from where most people live and where people will probably never visit, but recognize that those areas are available in their hometowns. There are lakes and streams and rivers that are just as remote and just as inaccessible to people of color unless we put in the effort to make it happen. We also have these barriers that can be overcome. We can bridge the gap. to literally make the connection between an Alaskan wilderness to a park in Madison, Wisconsin, or a river in Michigan, or a lake in Oregon. And so ultimately, our goal is to be able to take each of the 5 participants in this project, have a series of film screenings and events in their hometowns, specifically in Portland, Madison, Wisconsin, Atlanta, Georgia, Stevensville, Texas, and also in San Antonio. And ultimately, we hope to take this film around to locations all over the country. And we've already gotten, the film hasn't even premiered yet, and we've already gotten a couple of invitations to show it at film festivals and at a couple of independent screening venues. So we're really excited about what happens next. So we're moving it all very, very forward.
Excellent. Thank you so much, James. I look forward to seeing this documentary when it's finally released to the public. You said it's coming in Madison, so of course, looking forward to the screening in Madison as well. Thank you very much, James, for a really, really riveting conversation. Very deep dive into this issue. I expected nothing less, and you offered nothing less than what I expected. Phenomenal conversation. Thank you very much again for this time.
Well, it's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you again to our guest, Mr. James Mills. That the first film to be shown at the White House would be The Birth of a Nation highlights the importance and impact of policy, as that film heralded policies and belief systems espoused. Space for Black existence, normality of Black presence in natural spaces is not a new struggle. But Black people have made major contributions to ensuring natural space for all Americans, even when it was not safe for Black Americans to frequent those spaces that they helped enshrine. Whether it was the Buffalo Soldiers protecting and helping develop Yosemite National Park, the 25th Infantry's protection of Yellowstone, or Matthew Henderson, a Black man, being the first person, Black or white, to explore the North Pole. Black Americans have been a key part of America's relationship with the outdoors. The opportunity to connect to nature is not a luxury, it's a necessity. It's a human right. Connecting with nature is healing, it's relaxing, and everyone should have that opportunity if they want it. Whether it be fishing, hiking, rock climbing, surfing, swimming, camping, spelunking, skiing, running, biking, birding, or foraging, everyone can and everyone should, based on their own interest and ability. Go out there and enjoy nature. Get your feet dirty. Be good. You've been listening to the Black Fatherhood Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Alvin Thomas. I'm a clinical psychologist, researcher, and the director of the TriLab at the University of Wisconsin-Madison's School of Human Ecology. Original music for our series was composed and performed by Micaiah De Silva. Our series producer is Jill Ruby. The podcast is supported by the School of Human Ecology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you can follow me on Twitter at Dr_AT758. That's Dr_AT758. And on the web at thomaslab.humanecology.wisc.edu. Make sure to subscribe to the Black Fatherhood Podcast wherever you listen to your podcasts.